They laughed at her painting. They called it worthless. But when the truth was revealed, the entire class fell silent. At Willow Ridge Academy, wealth defines status. But today, a black girl's art will challenge everything. Will her masterpiece prove them wrong? Stay till the end to witness the moment that changed everything. Inspired by Martin Luther King Jr. We may go fast alone, but we go further together. Autumn sunlight streamed through the art room windows, casting shifting patterns across the wooden floor. Riverside Academy, one of the most prestigious private high schools in New York, was buzzing with excitement for its annual art competition. Most students gathered near the front, admiring the works displayed on sleek easels. But in one quiet, isolated corner, Aaliyah Carter sat alone. The 16-year-old girl, with her cascade of curls and deep, thoughtful eyes, gripped a pencil with steady precision. No expensive palette, no imported brushes, no premium canvas, like the others. Just an old sketchbook, a handful of worn-out colored pencils, and a cheap watercolor set. And yet, despite it all, her art breathed with an undeniable life. Each stroke, each shade wasn't just pigment on paper. It was emotion, a story, something money could never buy. She was lost in her world until, oh, look who's trying to be an artist. A sharp voice sliced through the quiet like a razor blade. Aaliyah looked up. Standing before her was Madison Harrington, the daughter of a wealthy businessman, the golden star of the art program, and the student everyone already assumed would win the competition. Arms crossed, lips painted in a perfect shade of red, Madison smirked. Behind her, Lauren and Sophie, her ever-present entourage, snickered, their gazes sweeping over Aaliyah's workspace with barely concealed disdain. "What are you even drawing?" Madison leaned down, plucking one of Aaliyah's pencils, twirling it between her fingers as if it were some foreign object. Colored pencils? God, what is this? Kindergarten? Lauren scoffed. Come on, Madison. Maybe that's all she can afford. Aaliyah said nothing. She simply reached out, took back her pencil, and resumed drawing. But Madison wasn't done. Anyway, she toyed with a strand of her golden hair, voice dripping with mockery. You don't actually think you have a chance, do you? Art is for people with class, and you don't belong. Aaliyah remained silent. She knew Madison wanted a reaction, a flicker of insecurity, a flash of anger, maybe even a weak protest. Anything to fuel her pleasure in tearing others down. But Aaliyah refused to give her that satisfaction. Instead, she set her pencil down and blew gently over her finished piece. A portrait, but not of a person. It was of hands, reaching out from the shadows, fingers grasping toward the light. A striking contrast of darkness and brilliance, painted with raw, unfiltered emotion. It wasn't technically flawless like Madison's work. There were no intricate blends, no textbook-perfect shading, but it had a soul. Aaliyah carefully tore the page from her sketchbook, slid it into a folder, and stood. All eyes followed her as she walked toward the submission table. Behind her, Madison folded her arms, watching with a smirk laced with cruel amusement. Oh, let's see what the judges think about a masterpiece drawn with children's crayons. Sophie giggled. She's actually serious? Lauren sneered. More like delusional. Madison only smirked. It didn't matter. The winner was already decided. At the submission area, paintings were carefully arranged on display. Madison's piece, a hyper-realistic portrait, every light and shadow meticulously placed, sat at the very center, a flawless exhibit of technical mastery. Meanwhile, Aaliyah's drawing had been placed near the edge, almost as if it didn't belong. But she didn't care. She simply took a step back and observed from afar. Deep down, she wasn't without doubt. But she also knew art wasn't a contest of price tags. It was about feeling. And if the judges could see that, are you seriously submitting this? Madison, again. She stood nearby, arms crossed, eyes gleaming with false pity. Lauren and Sophie flanked her, barely containing their laughter. I mean, I don't know what the judges will think, but maybe they'll appreciate your bravery. The words were carefully placed, a veiled insult wrapped in fake kindness. Madison wasn't saying Aaliyah's painting was bad. She was implying it was so bad that its only merit was the nerve to even enter. But Aaliyah didn't flinch. She met Madison's gaze, steady and unwavering. Art isn't just something you can buy. Her voice was calm, even. But it was enough. For the first time, Madison's smile faltered. Aaliyah didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked away. Behind her, Madison's hands clenched into fists. This wasn't over. The real game was just beginning. The energy in the art room shifted as the judges began their evaluations. Students clustered around the display area, whispering, analyzing, and stealing glances at the standout pieces. And at the center of it all, like a queen basking in her court's admiration, stood Madison Harrington. Her portrait painting, a breathtaking masterpiece, was displayed front and center, illuminated under the bright gallery lights. The colors blended seamlessly, each brushstroke smooth and deliberate, creating an image so lifelike it could have been mistaken for a high-resolution photograph. She had used the finest acrylics, paints that only students from certain backgrounds could afford. Madison stepped forward, her fingers lightly grazing the edge of her canvas as if it were a precious jewel. A remarkable piece, Madison. The room hushed at the sound of Mr. Parker's voice. He was the head judge of the competition, the school's esteemed art instructor, and his expression was nothing short of pleased. Flawless composition. Your handling of light truly showcases a deep understanding of technique. Madison smiled, not a modest, grateful smile, but one dripping with quiet triumph. She turned her head, slightly, just enough to glance at Aaliyah Carter, who stood at the edge of the room, silently observing. In that instant, an unspoken message passed between them. "You've already lost." The students around them murmured excitedly. "Madison, this is incredible. You were born to be an artist. There's no competition. She's obviously winning. Who else could they possibly choose?" Madison feigned humility, but her every movement exuded self-satisfaction, the effortless poise of someone raised in privilege, accustomed to winning. Then, as if just now remembering something, she turned toward the farthest edge of the exhibit, where Aaliyah's painting had been placed. But let's not forget. Madison strode toward it, voice laced with amusement. "We have a very unique entry here as well." Laughter rippled through her group. Aaliyah didn't flinch. She stood firm, but her fingers instinctively curled around the hem of her uniform, a silent betrayal of the tension brewing inside her. Madison stopped in front of her piece, tilting her head, pretending to examine it with great interest. "I'm not sure what style this is supposed to be." She tapped her chin in exaggerated thought. Lauren chimed in instantly. Maybe the too broke to afford real supplies style? Another round of laughter. Aaliyah stayed silent, but anyone paying close attention could see the quiet battle she was fighting within herself, trying to hold her ground against public humiliation. Her painting, the hands reaching out from the shadows, suddenly felt so small, so fragile beneath the weight of their scrutiny. Sophie crossed her arms, shaking her head in mock pity. I really wonder what the judges will think when they see this. The question hung in the air, suffocating. No one answered, but every pair of eyes fixated on Aaliyah's painting, some filled with amusement, others with sympathy. And then, everything changed. Mr. Parker and the judges approached. Instant silence. Madison straightened slightly, still wearing her knowing smirk, ready to receive more praise. The judges stopped at her painting first, nodding approvingly, exchanging quiet words of admiration. Madison barely paid attention. This was expected. But then, they moved on to Aaliyah's painting, and for the first time, the entire room seemed to pause. One of the judges, Evelyn Moore, a renowned artist, stopped before the artwork. She didn't immediately speak. She didn't analyze it with a clinical, technical eye. She simply felt it. The silence grew heavier. No one was laughing now. No one dared. After a long moment, Evelyn let out a soft breath, as if something had just moved within her. This painting, she murmured, her fingers gently grazing the paper's edge, has a soul. A simple sentence. But it shattered the entire atmosphere of ridicule. Madison's breath hitched, her expression faltered, just for a split second. But enough for Aaliyah to see it. The room buzzed with whispers. What does she mean? Why? Is she even looking at that piece? Madison's painting is obviously better, isn't it? Evelyn turned to Aaliyah, her gaze kind and inquisitive. Tell me about this piece, dear. Every single eye in the room turned to Aaliyah. She took a slow breath and, for the first time since the competition began, she spoke. It's about people like me. Her voice was soft, but unwavering. People without privilege. People without perfect beginnings. But we still reach. We still try to be seen. To be acknowledged. The room fell silent again. Not a single laugh. Not a single insult. Even Madison was speechless. In that moment, Aaliyah's painting was no longer just an entry in a competition. It was a voice. The air in the art room was heavy, as if someone had turned off all sound, leaving only an unspoken tension pressing down on the space. Aaliyah's painting, once pushed to the margins, now stood at the center of everyone's attention. Every eye was locked on the judges, waiting. Evelyn Moore remained in front of the artwork, her gaze lingering on the bold, unpolished strokes. There was a contemplative look on her face, one that made the entire room hold its breath. Madison hadn't spoken yet. She stood slightly apart, staring at the painting as though searching for a flaw, something, anything, that would justify dismissing it. But there was nothing to dismiss. And that was what unsettled her the most. Then Evelyn turned. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight to silence an entire room. Art is not just about technique or perfection. Art is emotion. It is a voice. And this painting has both. Madison clenched her jaw, her hands curled into fists at her sides, nails digging into the fabric of her uniform. Why was she saying this? There was no way this painting was better than hers. Lauren, Madison's closest friend, let out an awkward laugh, trying to break the thickening tension. But, Technically speaking, this piece isn't even fully developed. A few students murmured in agreement. Maybe they didn't truly look down on Aaliyah, but the idea of a scholarship student challenging the school's reigning art star, it was unheard of. Mr. Parker, the head judge, raised an eyebrow, fixing Lauren with a sharp look. Define fully developed. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. Did you know that Vincent van Gogh was ridiculed in his time? He was called an amateur, a man who didn't know how to mix colors. And now, each of his paintings is worth hundreds of millions. Silence. Lauren's face paled. Madison still said nothing. Then Evelyn stepped forward, this time looking directly at Aaliyah. What were you thinking when you painted this? All eyes turned to Aaliyah. She took a deep breath, and this time, her voice didn't waver. I painted for those who never get a chance, for the ones always pushed aside, but who keep reaching anyway. I painted myself. Her words weren't poetic, but they carried absolute truth. The energy in the room shifted. Some students, who hadn't given her work a second glance before, now looked at it differently. Maybe it wasn't as unimpressive as they had thought. Madison still didn't speak. She could feel people waiting for her reaction. But for the first time in her life, she had no words. She hated admitting it. But the truth was undeniable. Aaliyah's painting had a strange power. Not the power of flawless technique. Not the power of calculated lighting and perfect color theory. But something raw, something real. Before she even realized it, Madison had stepped closer, her gaze scanning every detail. The colors weren't vibrant, yet they had depth. The hands reaching from the darkness weren't just a metaphor. They had life. They carried a story, a longing. Her fingers instinctively gripped the edge of her skirt. Why did she feel affected? She shoved the thought away, straightening her posture, forcing herself back into the queen's role she had perfected for years. She wouldn't lose to Aaliyah. She couldn't. But then, the first voice to speak in support of Aaliyah didn't come from the judges. It came from a student, Ethan. A classmate, not one of Madison's close friends, but not someone who had ever stood up for Aaliyah before, either. Ethan stepped forward, eyes fixed on the painting. I think this is actually really powerful. A ripple of whispers spread through the room. Madison's head snapped toward him, stunned. What did you just say? Ethan shrugged, his tone calm but certain. People keep saying art is about technique, about perfection. But I think the real question is, does it make you feel something? He turned to Aaliyah, for the first time really looking at her. I don't know what you've been through, but I can feel it in this painting. Silence. No one had expected that. Then, another voice. A girl from the back of the crowd. Actually, I feel the same. The way the colors move, it's powerful. The support started to grow. Madison felt something tight coil in her chest. She had always been at the top. She had never been challenged like this before. And now, she was watching as the attention shifted. It wasn't on her anymore. For the first time, her perfection was standing next to something different. Something imperfect, but undeniably alive. Part of her wanted to laugh, to dismiss all of this as ridiculous. But another part, a small, buried part, knew she had just witnessed something special. Something even she couldn't deny. Mr. Parker scanned the room, reading every reaction, his gaze sharp. Then, finally, he spoke, voice firm. "Tomorrow, we announce the winner." A fresh wave of murmurs filled the air. Madison swallowed. She had never doubted her victory before. But now, for the first time, she wasn't so sure. Aaliyah still stood where she was, silent. But in her eyes, there was a fire. A spark Madison had never seen before. And for the first time in her life, Madison felt afraid. The air in the art room remained heavy long after Madison had left. The door had barely clicked shut behind her, leaving behind a silence that stretched on. But it wasn't the awkward silence of mockery. It wasn't the silence of dismissal. It was the silence of realization. The silence of people who had just witnessed something that made them question everything they thought they knew. Aaliyah remained where she stood, her fingers lightly gripping the hem of her uniform. She didn't move, didn't gloat, didn't even glance in Madison's direction. But deep down, she knew something had changed. And this was only the beginning. Evelyn Moore stepped forward, her sharp yet warm gaze steady. Quietly, she reached for Madison's easel and moved it, placing it beside Aaliyah's. Now, the two paintings stood together, side by side. The contrast was striking. Madison's portrait, a flawless display of technical skill, every brushstroke deliberate, every detail meticulously perfected. And yet, despite its beauty, there was a coldness to it. It felt crafted to impress rather than to express. Aaliyah's painting, on the other hand, lacked technical perfection, but it breathed. The hands reaching from the shadows weren't just an artistic choice. They meant something. The simplicity of the colors carried depth. The strokes radiated emotion. Evelyn placed a hand on both pieces. Then, she turned to face the class. "Now, I have a question." Every student watched her intently. Forget the names of the artists. Forget their reputations. Forget everything you think makes a piece worthy of winning. She stepped back, allowing them a full view of both paintings. "Tell me this. Which one speaks to you?" A beat of silence. Some students exchanged hesitant glances, waiting for someone else to speak first. Lauren and Sophie, Madison's closest friends, hesitated. They had been so sure Madison would win. But after everything that had just happened, they weren't so certain anymore. It was Ethan who broke the silence first. He took a step forward, eyes fixed on Aaliyah's painting once again. "I think," he said slowly, as if piecing the words together in real time, "this is the one that makes me feel something." The room turned toward him. Sophie frowned. "You mean Aaliyah's?" Ethan nodded. No hesitation. "I've seen plenty of beautiful paintings," he said, "but this is the first time I've looked at one and felt like it was telling me a story." Lauren swallowed hard, her confidence wavering. Then another voice. A girl from the back of the room. "I feel the same. The way the colors move. There's something really powerful about it." Another whisper. "It's like it actually means something." Aaliyah said nothing. She only listened. Just an hour ago, these same students had laughed at her, dismissed her. And now, they were defending her. They weren't talking about money, about supplies, about privilege. They were talking about art. Lauren bit her lip, then finally exhaled. "I guess Aaliyah's painting has something that Madison's doesn't." That single sentence was like a falling domino. One by one, heads began to nod. Students who had once stood firm in Madison's corner were uncertain now. Sophie stared at Aaliyah's. Work! Then slowly lowered her gaze. She had no argument left. Evelyn took her time scanning the room, reading each face carefully. She hadn't forced them to choose. She hadn't told them which painting was better, but the shift was undeniable. Slow, knowing nod. Art cannot be measured by price or prestige, Evelyn said. It only has one true standard. Does it make you feel something? And today, they had learned that lesson. Aaliyah remained still, taking in everything around her. She hadn't needed to defend herself. Her painting had done that for her. A small, quiet smile tugged at her lips, not out of victory, but out of something deeper. She had been seen, not by the judges, not by the teachers, but by the very people who had once doubted her. And that, more than anything, was the greatest win of all. The rhythmic click of Madison's heels echoed through the empty hallway. But even as she left the art room behind, the voices in her head refused to be silent. What if I've been wrong this whole time? The thought clung to her like a shadow, refusing to let go. She had intended to walk away, to put the humiliation behind her, to forget the feeling of no longer being the center of attention. But her feet wouldn't move forward. She stopped, breath unsteady, and then, like a reluctant soldier unable to resist looking back at the battlefield, Madison turned. She walked to the large window overlooking the art room. Standing there, concealed behind the curtain, she watched. No one saw her, but she saw everything. Her eyes landed on the two paintings, standing side by side. Her painting, a flawless masterpiece of technical skill, perfectly calculated lighting, each brush stroke executed with precision, and Aaliyah's painting, hands reaching out from the darkness, the colors simple yet undeniably alive. She had once thought it was amateurish, incomplete, but now she couldn't look away. She had never thought much of this painting. So why did it feel like it was telling a story? For the first time, Madison truly saw it, not as a competitor, but as someone trying to understand. And the truth hit her like a punch straight to her pride. That painting had soul, and hers, it was beautiful. But it didn't feel. A shiver ran down Madison's spine. She couldn't deny it anymore. She stood there, motionless, conflicted, unsteady, and for the first time, shaken by something other than losing. Regret, not because she had lost, but because, maybe, she had never truly understood art at all. The paintings she had created, the works she had once prided herself on, they were perfect, impeccable, flawless, but they never had a story to tell, and that realization terrified her. Her fingers twitched at her side. She wanted to open the door, to ask Aaliyah how she had painted, something that made people feel. But her hand hesitated over the doorknob. Inside the classroom, Aaliyah was still speaking with the judges. She smiled, not in victory, but because, for the first time, she had been heard. Madison watched that smile and realized she had never smiled like that when she painted. She had always painted to be recognized, to be the best. But she had never painted for herself. She remained standing at the door. At that moment, Lauren, her closest friend, turned back and spotted Madison. There was no mockery in Lauren's expression, no pity, just a silent question. "Do you understand now?" Madison pressed her lips together and took a step back. She wasn't ready to face the truth. Not yet. She wasn't ready to say the words she knew were waiting on her tongue. I was wrong. As she turned to leave, her gaze fell upon a painting hanging in the hallway. She had passed by this corridor 100 times, but she had never really looked at this painting before. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't displayed under the brightest light, but there was a quiet gentleness in its strokes, a raw emotion that she had never noticed before. For the first time, Madison truly looked at it, and it made her wonder, how many things have I missed? Because I was too focused on being perfect. As she walked away, something small slipped from her bag. A colored pencil. She bent down to pick it up, fingers closing around it. Then hesitated. She stared at the pencil for a long moment. It was the first one she had ever used. Back when she had drawn just for the love of it. Back when she didn't care about praise or awards or being the best. Madison tightened her grip around it, a quiet smile forming on her lips. Not one of pride, not one of victory, but the smile of someone who was beginning to change. As she walked out of the hallway, she was no longer the same person she had been before. She wasn't ready to admit defeat, but she had started to ask questions. For the first time, she wasn't just looking at technique, she was looking at the soul behind a painting. And she knew. One day, she wanted to create a piece like that too, not to win, but to feel. The art room was wrapped in an eerie silence. No more laughter, no more ridicule, only anticipation, waiting for the verdict. Mr. Parker stood at the center of the room, the final score sheet in his hands. Before him, two paintings, contrasting in every way. One, a masterpiece of technical precision, yet cold. The other, raw and imperfect, yet full of meaning. He looked at his students, then spoke, his voice low but firm. Which of these pieces truly makes you feel something? Another long silence. Some students glanced at Madison's painting, then at Aaliyah's. Lauren and Sophie hesitated. Then, from the back of the room, Ethan took a deep breath and broke the silence. I choose Aaliyah's. Heads turned toward him, but Ethan stood firm, because it has a soul, a ripple, a small shift. Then, I think so too, a girl murmured. Another student raised their hand, then another, and then the whole class. Madison stood frozen, her hands clenched at her sides. She had known this was coming, but facing it, truly facing it, was something else entirely. Evelyn Moore surveyed the room as if making sure no one objected. Then she nodded and turned back to Mr. Parker. And finally, the moment they had all been waiting for. The winner of this year's competition is Aaliyah Carter. Silence for just a second. Then, applause. Soft at first, then growing like a wave crashing through the room, breaking through every invisible wall. Aaliyah couldn't believe it. Not because she thought she didn't deserve it, but because, for the first time, she was being seen. Truly, undeniably seen. She clutched the hem of her sweater, inhaled deeply. This wasn't just her victory. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been dismissed. She stepped forward to accept the award. But as she turned back toward the room, her gaze instinctively searched for one person, Madison. She stood off to the side. She wasn't clapping. She wasn't objecting. She was simply watching. Her fingers curled into the fabric of her uniform. No one looked at her as a loser. But Madison felt like one. She felt as if something inside her had cracked. Something she had spent years building. And Aaliyah saw it. Instead of walking away, she stepped toward Madison. Madison stiffened. She didn't know how to handle this. But when Aaliyah stopped in front of her, there was no gloating, no pity, only genuine sincerity. Aaliyah extended her hand. The entire class held its breath. Madison stared at the outstretched hand. Her pride screamed at her to turn away. But somewhere deep inside her, another part of her wanted to take it. And in that single, endless moment, she remembered all the times she had laughed at Aaliyah, all the times she had believed money defined talent, all the times she had painted for recognition, not for herself. The moment stretched on. Then, Madison inhaled deeply, and slowly, she reached out. Their hands met, just a handshake, but heavier than any words. Aaliyah smiled. "We can learn from each other." Madison blinked, startled. Aaliyah had never wanted to beat her. She had only ever wanted to be heard. And Madison understood. She swallowed her pride and gave a small nod. Not much, just a little. But it meant more than anything. After the handshake, Madison didn't leave right away. She looked at Aaliyah's painting again. This time, not to judge it, but to understand it. She reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the frame, as if, for the first time, she truly wanted to see a painting the way Aaliyah did. Aaliyah noticed, but she said nothing, because she knew Madison was changing. Madison finally stepped back and turned toward the door. But just as she reached the hallway, she stopped. A single autumn leaf drifted down, landing softly on the empty space where her painting had once been displayed. She stared at it, eyes narrowing slightly. Change always came in ways no one expected. She let out a slow breath. Then, she walked away. But not as the same person she had been before. Aaliyah watched Madison go. Then she turned back, sunlight streaming in, casting a golden glow over her painting. A small smile touched her lips. Because she knew this victory was bigger than her. It was a victory for something greater, a new way of thinking. A world where art wasn't measured by money, but by soul. And that was the greatest win of all. Madison walked slowly down the empty hallway. The outcome had been decided, but what weighed on her mind wasn't the fact that she had lost. It was why she had lost. For so long, she had believed that art was about precision, about flawless execution. But when she looked at Aaliyah's painting, that belief had been challenged. She had technique, but she had never painted with feeling. And that was why she lost. The art room was nearly empty now. Only Aaliyah remained, quietly packing up her supplies. Madison hesitated in the doorway, her gaze falling on the worn-out brushes, the old tubes of paint, the very things she had once dismissed. But now, they meant something else. Taking a breath, Madison finally spoke. "Who taught you how to paint?" Aaliyah looked up, slightly surprised. "Mostly self-taught," she said. "But I observe a lot." "Observe what?" Aaliyah smiled lightly. "Everything. The way light moves across water. The way tree shadows shift throughout the day. The faces passing by on the subway." For the first time, Madison began to see the world differently. Aaliyah carefully closed her paint box. "You're incredibly skilled, Madison. But if one day you paint not to win, but to express something real, I think you'd be even better." Madison couldn't argue with that. She had always painted for recognition, never for herself. She had let the fear of imperfection hold her creativity hostage. She took a slow, steady breath. She could walk away now, end this conversation. But instead, she did something she never expected. "Would you teach me?" Aaliyah blinked. "Teach you? Teach me how to see the world the way you do." Madison traced a finger along the edge of the desk. "Maybe it's time I try something different." Aaliyah studied her for a moment. Then she nodded. "All right." Madison had never imagined she would be learning from Aaliyah. But some lessons couldn't be found in textbooks. Aaliyah smiled. "We can start tomorrow." Madison exhaled, a small, almost amused smile forming on her lips. "Good, but don't expect me to throw away everything I know about technique." Aaliyah laughed. "Who said you have to? I'll just show you how to use it differently." They looked at each other, not as rivals anymore, but as two artists, two people, who could learn from one another. Madison and Aaliyah stepped out of the art room together. The golden hues of sunset bathed the hallway in a soft, warm glow. For the first time, Madison didn't feel pressure or competition, only the quiet promise of a new beginning, a new chapter in her journey with art, and maybe a new chapter within herself. The golden light of sunset streamed through the glass windows, painting the hallway in a soft, amber glow. Aaliyah stood in front of the exhibition room, quietly gazing at her painting. For the first time, it wasn't pushed into a corner. For the first time, people didn't look at it with pity or doubt, but with genuine recognition. She had proven that art didn't have to come from wealth or privilege, but more importantly, she had changed the way people saw it. From across the room, Madison was watching too. She no longer felt anger, no longer felt jealousy, only a strange, unfamiliar stillness. Aaliyah's painting wasn't just a beautiful piece of art. It was a reminder that art was never about winning or losing. It was a journey, one that led people to discover themselves. And, for the first time, Madison understood that. Aaliyah turned, noticing Madison standing there. She wasn't surprised, and Madison didn't look away. They held each other's gaze, no longer rivals, no longer separated by the worlds they came from. Madison took a step closer. "Will you keep painting?" she asked, her voice no longer sharp like before. Aaliyah nodded, smiling. "Always." "Good." Madison gave a small nod. "Then I will too." It wasn't a challenge, it was an acknowledgement, a recognition. Aaliyah left first, her footsteps quiet against the floor. Madison stayed behind, standing before the painting. She looked at it for a long time, as if wanting to memorize it. She had once thought that if she didn't win, everything would be over. But now she understood. This was only the beginning. Not the beginning of another competition, but of a different kind of journey. One that was no longer bound by perfection or validation. One where she would finally find her own voice. And this time, she wouldn't be alone. Tomorrow, when Aaliyah's painting left this room for the city exhibition, it wouldn't just be a piece of art. It would be a symbol of change, of a new generation of artists, a generation that would no longer measure talent by status or wealth, but by what was truly felt. Aaliyah had changed something, not with arguments, not with defiance, but simply with her art. And Madison knew she wanted to do the same, not to surpass Aaliyah, but to become an artist in her own way. As Madison stepped out of the exhibition room, Aaliyah was waiting outside. They didn't need to say much. A single glance, a small nod. No longer opponents, but two artists, growing, learning, and moving forward together. Outside, the sun dipped below the towering skyline of New York. One day had ended, but a new journey, a new way of thinking, had only just begun. Do you believe that art is more than just brushstrokes? That it is the voice of the soul? If this story moved you, like and subscribe to help spread the power of passion, resilience, and change. Share the moment that touched you the most in the comments, because who knows, your story might just inspire someone else.